What if Breath of the Wild had a darker, more cinematic cousin? One with magic-infused battles, colossal enemies, and a world where the elements themselves could be weaponized. Eternal Strands is the debut title from Yellow Brick Games, an indie studio founded by industry veterans that aims to carve out its own identity in the action-adventure space. But does it truly stand on its own, or does it live too much in the shadow of its inspirations? Let's break it down. We'd also like to thank the publisher who provided a review copy of Eternal Strands for this analysis. At its core, Eternal Strands feels like an open-world action RPG with heavy Breath of the Wild influences. You play as Brynn, a fearless weaver on a quest to reclaim the lost cultural home of her people. Armed with elemental magic and a selection of weapons, you'll face a variety of enemies, from humanoid constructs to colossal titanic beasts. Sound familiar? Eternal Strands incorporates a stamina system, climb anywhere mechanics, and a magical toolkit that feels very much in line with Zelda's Sheikah Slate. Instead of that, Brynn wields the Mantle, a magical cloak that channels raw elemental energy into fire, ice, and telekinetic force. This allows for creative problem solving, freezing lakes to cross gaps, using fire to clear obstacles, or launching enemies with sheer telekinetic might. Eternal Strands enhances realism in the way its elemental abilities interact with the world. Fire spreads naturally, ice can harm you, and friendly fire is always on. If you're not careful, that massive explosion you just triggered, yeah, it's gonna cook you too. While this makes combat feel more dynamic, it can also make it frustrating, especially when battles get chaotic. The combat in Eternal Strands is both strategic and punishing. Between its stamina-based movement and its friendly fire mechanics, every fight requires careful planning. It's reminiscent of Final Fantasy's magic system, where elemental attacks don't just hit enemies, they shape the battlefield. But in execution, it doesn't always feel as smooth as it should. Animations can feel stiff, and movement isn't always as responsive as you'd expect from a game of this caliber. In theory, Eternal Strands wants you to feel powerful, but in practice, the game's mechanics sometimes get in the way of that power fantasy. If there's one thing Eternal Strands gets absolutely right, it's world building. The environments are dense and visually striking, offering a rich world to explore. From the ruins of the Enclave to the capital city of Dynavron, every location feels meticulously designed, rich with history. The storytelling is also engaging, though it leans heavily into classic high fantasy tropes. The dialogue has that Tolkien-esque cadence, complete with British accents and grandiose speeches. If you love that kind of storytelling, it works. If you don't, well, be prepared for a lot of poetic monologue. The soundtrack fits the setting well, but doesn't leave a lasting impact. It follows the traditional high fantasy orchestral formula, making it immersive but not particularly memorable. In a game with such a striking world, the music had the potential to be a stronger driving force, but it ultimately plays it safe. So, does Eternal Strands stand on its own, or is it just another Zelda clone? Honestly, it's a bit of both. The world, story, and elemental mechanics are fantastic, but the game leans so heavily into Breath of the Wild's DNA that it's hard to ignore the similarities. But if you're looking for something completely fresh, you might find it a bit too familiar. There are a lot of strong elements to this game, but there are also some glaring issues. The gorgeous world and deep environmental storytelling, combined with an innovative elemental magic system and intense cinematic combat against giant foes, create a compelling experience. However, the combat can feel stiff and frustrating. The Zelda influence is hard to ignore, and the animations and traversal mechanics lack polish. What do you think? Does Eternal Strands do enough to set itself apart, or does it borrow too much from its influences? Let us know in the comments, and as always, may your adventures be filled with epic quests and legendary victories.